The bell jingled softly as Jonathan Lancaster stepped into the small-town diner, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. He adjusted the cuff of his designer suit, standing out among the locals who sat in worn-out booths, chatting over plates of eggs and toast. It was an unplanned stop during his business trip, a rare moment of spontaneity for a man whose schedule was typically planned down to the minute. "Morning, sir. Have a seat anywhere you like," a cheerful voice called out. Jonathan glanced up, his gaze landing on a young waitress weaving between tables, a notepad in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. She was no older than 20, with warm brown eyes and a bright smile. But what stopped him cold was the mark on the inside of her wrist. A small, uniquely shaped birthmark. His heart slammed against his ribs. He knew that birthmark. He had traced its delicate shape countless times on the wrist of his late wife, Margaret. It was a distinctive swirl, almost like a crescent moon. His breath hitched as he watched the girl pour coffee for a customer, completely unaware of the turmoil she had just ignited in him. Impossible. Margaret had died nearly 2 decades ago, and their unborn child had never made it into the world. At least, that's what he had been told. That Jonathan's mind raced as he slid into a booth, his fingers tightening around the menu. He needed to know more. "Excuse me, miss," he called out when she passed by his table. The girl turned, flashing him an easy smile. "Yes, sir? What can I get you?" Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Just coffee, please. And your name?" She hesitated for a second before answering. Emma Carter." Jonathan's pulse thundered in his ears. That name meant nothing to him. And yet, as he looked into her eyes, Margaret's eyes, he knew he couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion growing in his chest. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a secret waiting to be uncovered. Jonathan gripped his coffee cup tightly, his hands slightly trembling. Emma Carter. The name felt foreign, yet the girl wearing it looked eerily familiar. It wasn't just the birthmark. It was the shape of her eyes, the arch of her brows. Margaret's delicate features echoed in her face. Emma, oblivious to his internal turmoil, poured his coffee with a practiced ease. "Cream or sugar, sir?" she asked politely. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Black is fine." She nodded and smiled again before turning away, moving to another table. Jonathan watched her go, his mind spinning. Could it be possible? Could she be mine? He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It was old, from his early days with Margaret, back when they were still young and full of dreams. The picture showed Margaret in their first apartment, smiling playfully at the camera. Her wrist, turned slightly, revealed that same crescent-shaped birthmark. Jonathan had mourned deeply when he lost Margaret in a tragic accident. She had been pregnant at the time, and the doctors had given him the devastating news. Both mother and child had not survived. He had been too grief-stricken to question anything back then. But now, had he been lied to? He needed answers. That as Emma returned to clear a nearby table, Jonathan forced himself to sound casual. "Excuse me, Emma. How long have you lived in this town?" She glanced at him curiously, but answered without hesitation. "All my life, sir. Born and raised here." Jonathan's grip on his coffee cup tightened. If she had lived here her whole life, someone in town would know her story. He had the resources to dig deeper. He pulled out his phone under the table and quickly typed a message to his assistant. "Look into an Emma Carter from Pinebrook. Age around 19 to 21. I need everything: birth records, parents, hospital details." "Urgent." His assistant, efficient as ever, responded within minutes. On it. Jonathan's pulse quickened. If this girl was really his daughter, who had stolen her from him? Jonathan forced himself to finish his coffee, but his mind was miles away. He watched Emma move gracefully between tables, chatting with customers, laughing at a joke an older man made. There was something warm and kind about her, a familiar softness he had loved in Margaret. His phone buzzed in his pocket. His assistant had already found something. He discreetly glanced at the message. Emma Carter, 20 years old. No official birth certificate on record until age 5. Adopted by Mark and Susan Carter. No records of biological parents. Jonathan's heartbeat quickened. Adopted. Emma was not a Carter by blood. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. If she had been adopted at 5, where had she been before that? And more importantly, was she really his daughter? He took a deep breath and slid his phone away. He needed to approach this carefully. If he came on too strong, he might scare her. If she really was his daughter, she had spent her life believing something else. He couldn't just drop a bombshell on her. Instead, he decided to start with someone who might have answers. He stood up, leaving a generous tip on the table, and walked toward the counter where an older woman, probably the owner, was refilling a coffee pot. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, keeping his voice calm. "That young waitress, Emma, she seems like a wonderful girl. Has she worked here long?" The woman looked up and smiled warmly. "Oh, Emma, she's been here since she was 16. Good kid, always works hard." She paused, glancing toward Emma. "You know, it's funny. She doesn't look much like Mark and Susan, but they love her like she's their own." Jonathan nodded, his suspicions growing. Were they her real parents? The woman gave him a curious look. "No, they adopted her when she was little. She doesn't talk much about it, but I know she spent a few years in foster care before they took her in." "Why do you ask?" Jonathan forced a small smile. "Just curious. She reminds me of someone I used to know." His heart pounded. Foster care, a missing birth record, a rare birthmark identical to Margaret's. The pieces were coming together, but he still needed proof. There was only one way to be sure, that a DNA test. Jonathan pulled out his phone once more and typed another message. "Find out where Emma Carter was before her adoption. Give me access to her records. And order a DNA test kit. I'll handle the rest." He had come to this small town for business. Now, he had found something far more important. He had found a missing piece of his heart. Jonathan spent the rest of the day pacing in his hotel room, waiting for his assistant's update. He had no appetite. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories of Margaret, the possibility of Emma being his daughter, and the fear that he might be wrong. His phone vibrated. A new message popped up. "Emma Carter's foster care records are sparse. Entered the system at age 3. No biological family listed. She was found abandoned outside a church in Chicago. No known relatives." Jonathan's hands clenched. Chicago. That was where Margaret had gone when she left him, where she had disappeared from his life. Another message followed. "DNA, kit delivered. Should arrive by morning." He exhaled deeply. This was it. He just needed to convince Emma to take the test. But how? He couldn't simply tell her the truth. Not yet did a knock at the door startled him. Jonathan hesitated before answering. When he opened the door, an elderly woman with kind eyes stood there. She looked vaguely familiar. "Mr. Kingsley?" she asked softly. Jonathan frowned. "Yes." She smiled gently. "My name is Helen Moore. I run the diner. I noticed the way you were looking at Emma today. Something tells me you didn't come back just for coffee." Jonathan stiffened. "What are you implying?" Helen stepped inside, uninvited, lowering her voice. "I knew her mother." His heart nearly stopped. "Margaret?" Helen nodded. "She lived here for a while years ago. A quiet woman, always looking over her shoulder. One day, she came in with a baby. I remember because the little girl had the most striking eyes, just like Emma." Jonathan felt like the air had been knocked out of him. What happened to her? Helen's expression darkened. "She left. One night, without a word. The next day, Emma was found outside a church in Chicago. We all wondered if she'd been abandoned, but I always had a feeling her mother was running from something." Jonathan's throat tightened. Margaret had been in this very town, with their child, and she had vanished. That he swallowed hard. Did she ever say why she left? Helen shook her head. "No, but if you think Emma is connected to her, then you deserve to know the truth." Jonathan met her gaze. "And Emma deserves to know it too." Jonathan barely slept that night. The revelation from Helen haunted him. Margaret had been here. She had Emma with her. And then she vanished. But why? He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them, through Emma. The next morning, he arrived at the diner early, just as the sun peeked over the horizon. Emma was already inside, wiping down tables, her blonde ponytail swaying as she moved. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Back again?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Jonathan managed a small smile. "I told you, best coffee in town." She smirked. "That's what you said yesterday." He hesitated. then took a deep breath. Emma, can I talk to you? Somewhere private. She frowned, suddenly wary. Why? He hesitated. He couldn't just blurt it out. He needed to be careful. I think I might have known your mother. Her eyes widened in shock. My mother? Jonathan nodded, watching her closely. Her name was Margaret. She lived in this town years ago. Emma's face went pale. I don't know anything about my mother. I was in foster care since I was little. Jonathan's heart clenched. She really didn't know. That's why I want to talk to you, he said gently. I might be able to help you learn more about her. Emma took a deep breath, her hands gripping the table. Okay, she said hesitantly, but I don't get why you care so much. Jonathan swallowed hard. Because I think I might be your father. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Emma blinked. Then she laughed, shaking her head. You're joking, right? I wish I were, he said softly. I don't expect you to believe me right away. That's why I want to do a DNA test. Just to be sure. Emma stared at him, her expression unreadable. A DNA test? You want me to take a DNA test? With you? He nodded. If I'm wrong, I'll walk away. But if I'm right, then you deserve to know the truth. She bit her lip, looking down at her hands. I don't know. Jonathan leaned forward. I won't force you. It's your choice. But if there's even a small chance that I'm telling the truth, wouldn't you want to know? Emma exhaled slowly, then met his gaze. Okay, I'll do it. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. Thank you, Emma. As he handed her the DNA kit, his hands trembled. This was it, the moment that could change everything. And deep down, he knew he wasn't ready for the truth. The ride to the DNA testing facility was silent. Emma sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window. Jonathan could tell she was overwhelmed. Who wouldn't be? He wanted to say something to comfort her, but he knew words wouldn't do much right now. Once they arrived, the process was quick. Cheek swabs, paperwork, and the agonizing wait for results. It'll take a few days, the nurse said as she sealed the samples. Emma nodded, still visibly shaken. Jonathan watched her closely, unsure of how she was processing everything. As they walked out, Emma finally spoke. So, if this is real, if you really are my father, what then? Jonathan exhaled. I don't know yet, but if it's true, I'd like to be in your life, if you'll have me. She looked down at her hands. That's a big if. He smiled faintly. I understand. Emma hesitated, then finally looked at him. And what about my mom? Do you know what happened to her? Jonathan's heart clenched. I don't know, but I swear, I'll find out. Emma nodded slowly. Okay. For the first time, Jonathan saw a tiny glimmer of trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Now all they could do was wait. 3 days had never felt so long. Jonathan found himself constantly checking his phone, even though he knew the results wouldn't come any faster. Emma was no different. She acted normal at work, but Jonathan noticed her hands shaking whenever she poured coffee or scribbled down an order. Then, on the 3rd day, Jonathan's phone buzzed. His breath caught when he saw the notification. Your DNA test results are ready. Emma stood across the diner, balancing a tray of plates. He caught her eye, lifting his phone slightly. She knew. She set the tray down with a deep breath and walked over. Do we open it together? She asked, her voice quiet. Jonathan nodded. Whenever you're ready. They stepped outside, away from the chatter of the diner, and sat on a wooden bench. Jonathan's fingers trembled slightly as he tapped the screen to open the results. He scrolled down. And then there was 0.99.9% parent-child match. The world seemed to freeze. Emma sucked in a sharp breath. Oh my God! Jonathan stared at the screen, emotions crashing over him like a tidal wave. She really was his daughter. Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she covered her mouth with her hand. I don't even know what to say. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. You don't have to say anything. Just know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Emma nodded, exhaling shakily. So, what now? Jonathan met her gaze. Now, we find out what happened to your mother. Emma wiped at her eyes and nodded. Okay. And just like that, their journey was only beginning. The reality of the DNA results settled between them like a quiet storm. Emma was still reeling, but Jonathan could see it in her eyes. Beneath the shock, there was something else. Hope. But there were still too many unanswered questions. "I need to know the truth about my mother," Emma finally said, her voice steady. "If you really knew her, then why did she never tell me about you?" Jonathan exhaled. "I don't know, but I have a way to find out." Emma's brows furrowed. "How?" Jonathan reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It was the only picture he had left of her, Anna. She was smiling, radiant, holding his hand in a way that made it look like she never wanted to let go. That he handed the photo to Emma, who stared at it in stunned silence. "She looks so young here," Emma whispered. "So happy." Jonathan's heart clenched. She was... Emma traced the edges of the photo. Where was this taken? New York, almost 20 years ago. Emma's expression darkened. "That doesn't make sense. My mom always told me she moved to this town before I was born. She never mentioned New York." Jonathan's stomach twisted. If Anna had never told Emma about him, what else had she hidden? "I have a friend," Jonathan said carefully. "A private investigator. He can help us track down what happened to her." Emma hesitated. "And if we find out something we don't like?" Jonathan met her gaze. "Then at least we'll know the truth." Emma took a deep breath. "Okay, let's do it." Neither of them knew what they were about to uncover. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of the mystery. The next morning, Jonathan made a call to his longtime friend and private investigator, Mark Lawson. Mark had worked for him in the past, handling discreet matters with the utmost efficiency. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. "I need you to dig into someone for me," Jonathan said when Mark picked up. Her name was Anna Carter. She lived in this town about 20 years ago. Mark's voice was laced with curiosity. "That's an interesting request. Any particular reason?" Jonathan hesitated for a second before replying. "She might have been the love of my life, and she might have had my daughter without telling me." There was a beat of silence. Then Mark spoke. "All right, I'll get on it. I'll start by pulling public records and see what I can find. Give me a day or two." After the call, Jonathan turned to Emma, who sat across from him at a small cafe. She was quiet, still absorbing everything. "It feels weird," she finally said. "Like my whole life was built on something that might not be true." Jonathan understood that feeling all too well. He had spent years mourning Anna, believing she was gone forever, only to discover that she had kept a piece of him behind. "No matter what we find, Emma," he said, "I just want you to know that you're not alone in this." Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his for sincerity. "And if it turns out my mom had a reason for keeping me a secret?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "Then we'll find out why." 2 days later, Mark called back. His voice was serious. "Jonathan, I found something, and it's not what you're expecting." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "What is it?" Mark exhaled. Anna Carter wasn't the name she was born with. She changed it after leaving New York. Before that, she went by Anna Whitmore. Jonathan's blood ran cold. "Whitmore?" Mark continued. "Yes. And here's the real shocker. She didn't leave New York because she wanted to. She was running from someone." Jonathan's heart pounded. "From who?" There was a long pause before Mark answered. "From her family." Emma, who had been listening, stiffened. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated. "Anna Whitmore wasn't just anyone, Jonathan. She came from one of the wealthiest families in New York. And from what I've found, she had every reason to disappear." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "What happened to her?" Mark sighed. "That's where things get complicated. Anna didn't just disappear. She was forced to leave." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" Mark hesitated before delivering the final blow. "Because she was pregnant and her family didn't approve." The words landed like a thunderclap. Jonathan felt as if the ground had just been ripped out from beneath him. Anna had been forced to leave? She hadn't abandoned him. She had been driven away. Emma's hands trembled. "You're saying my mom ran away from her family because she was pregnant with me?" Mark's voice was grim. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Jonathan's mind raced. If Anna had run away from her wealthy family to keep her child safe, what had she been protecting Emma from? And more importantly, was that danger still out there? "I need to know everything, Mark," Jonathan said, his voice steely. Because if anyone hurt Anna or forced her to give up the life she deserved, I swear, I won't let them get away with it. Mark's response was simple. Then buckle up, because we're only scratching the surface. Jonathan gripped his phone tightly, his mind racing with unanswered questions. If Anna had been forced to leave, then someone, perhaps her own family, had taken drastic steps to ensure she disappeared. But why? Emma sat across from him, her face pale, her hands clenched together. She had spent her whole life believing she was just an ordinary girl from a small town. Now, she was learning that her mother had been hiding a past filled with secrets. What do we do now? Emma asked, her voice shaky. Jonathan exhaled slowly. We find out exactly who forced your mother to leave and why. He turned back to Mark on the phone. Tell me everything you've got. Mark sighed. Anna's father was Richard Whitmore. Old money, real estate empire, ruthless businessman. He ran his family like a corporation, cold, calculated, and with zero tolerance for scandal. When Anna got pregnant, he must have seen it as a threat to their reputation. Jonathan clenched his jaw. So, he forced her to leave? Looks that way. I found a few old news articles from 23 years ago. They mention Anna, but then nothing. It's like she vanished overnight. Emma swallowed hard. That means my grandfather might still be alive. Jonathan studied her face. There was a mix of fear and curiosity in her eyes. He is, Mark confirmed. Richard Whitmore is still alive, still running the family business, and still just as powerful. Jonathan felt a wave of anger surge through him. If Richard had driven Anna away, leaving her to raise a child on her own, he had to answer for it. Where can I find him? Jonathan asked. Mark hesitated. That's the tricky part. He's extremely private. But I do have an address, his estate in New York. Jonathan met Emashkesh. I think it's time we paid him a visit. The Whitmore estate was everything Jonathan expected. Massive, intimidating, and surrounded by a high iron gate that screamed exclusivity. The moment he and Emma arrived, security guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. State your business, one of them said. Jonathan stood tall. Tell Richard Whitmore that his granddaughter is here to see him. The guards exchanged uneasy glances before one of them turned and spoke into a hidden earpiece. Moments later, the gate opened, and they were escorted inside. That Emma's grip tightened on Jonathan's arm. I don't know if I'm ready for this. Jonathan squeezed her hand. No matter what happens, you're not alone. Inside, the mansion was cold, pristine, and eerily quiet. A butler led them to a massive study, where an elderly man sat behind a grand oak desk. His silver hair was neatly combed, his piercing blue eyes, so much like Emma's. Assessing them with calculating precision, Richard Whitmore didn't rise. He simply folded his hands and studied them. I was wondering when you'd show up. Emma inhaled sharply. You knew about me? Richard's expression didn't waver. Of course. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Then why did you force Anna to leave? A flicker of something unreadable crossed Richard's face. I did what I had to do. Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling. She was your daughter. Richard exhaled slowly. She was reckless. She refused to follow the family's expectations. When she got pregnant with, his gaze shifted to Jonathan. Your child, she refused to listen. She wanted to leave behind everything. Her wealth, her inheritance, her family name, for you. Jonathan's breath hitched. Then why not let her? Richard's voice darkened. Because it wasn't just about her. It was about the Whitmore name, the empire I built. I couldn't let one mistake destroy everything. Emma's eyes filled with unshed tears. You call me a mistake? For the first time, Richard's face softened. No, I knew you existed. I made sure you were safe. But I also knew that if you ever found your way back here, it would mean Anna's love for you never wavered. Jonathan's stomach twisted. You had no right to make that decision for her. Richard leaned back. You think I don't regret it? You think I don't wonder what life would have been like if I had let her stay? He sighed, looking suddenly older. I made my choice, and now you have a choice to make too. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. What do you mean? Richard reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the desk. Inside, this is everything you would have inherited had your mother stayed. You're a Whitmore by blood. If you want, you can claim what's rightfully yours. Jonathan tensed. And if she doesn't? Richard's eyes met Emma's. Then you walk away, and we never see each other again. Silence filled the room. Emma stared at the envelope as if it held the weight of the world. Finally, she whispered, I don't need money. I just wanted to know why. Richard hesitated before saying softly, Then you have your answer. Jonathan placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. Come on, kid, let's go. But as they turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped them. Emma, if you ever change your mind, my door is always open. She didn't look back. For her, this chapter was finally closed.